Good morning, everybody. Great to be with you. We're in the book of John this morning. We're in a series called I Am, and we have been learning about who Jesus claims to be, who he says that he is. And this is a part of a year that we've been spending as a church in God's story, trying to understand more of the Bible, trying to get more of who God is and how he made us. And we're finally in the New Testament. If you've been doing the reading plans with us, we got into the Gospel of Matthew on Friday, and it's been a great time to hop back in and join us if you've dropped off or you never started with us in the first place. But we're trying to read every page of the scriptures this year, or at least more than we did last year. That's part of our plan. Is just we're going to grow in our love of the scriptures and our love of Jesus as we read together. And so we're to Jesus now. And one of the things we've been seeing about Jesus is that when he tells us who he is, he ties his identity to the story of God that we've been reading together in the Old Testament. He shows us how the stories of the Old Testament, the stories of what God was doing, they all point to Jesus. He's the fulfillment of all of them. We're going to see one way that that is true this morning. But as we are in this series and as we're unpacking this together, I want us to remember why this matters. This is how John ends his gospel. After he's told us all the things he's told us, he says, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." That's the invitation to you this morning. Will you believe in Jesus? And not just a one-time thing. You believe in him once and you become a Christian and then you go on with your life. No, today, this hour, this week in your life, will you believe that Jesus is who he claims to be, that he can be for you what he claims to be? And as we learn a little bit more about that this morning, we're going to be talking about the idea of light. I love sunlight. This is my favorite time of year as the days get longer and the sun is out, or at least that's how it's supposed to be. I mean, holy moly, at least there was one day this last week, the sun was out late. I set up all my deck furniture and we ate dinner out on the deck, and it was like 50 degrees and I was freezing, but I was just soaking in the sunlight. God wired us this way. You probably are that way too. We need sunlight to thrive. We need sunlight to be happy. That's why people in Seattle are depressed all the time. We don't get enough sunlight to be happy. I mean, maybe you've heard of seasonal affective disorder or SAD, seasonal depression that comes from not enough sunlight. I learned a new one just this week. It's called fake spring sadness, and I've been experiencing it. It's where there's supposed to be spring, and it's supposed to be sun, and it doesn't come, and you suffer from fake spring sadness. So if that's you, we're suffering together this morning. But there's something about light that's so universal to the human experience. Life needs light. Like in darkness, you don't see flourishing plants and people living. In the light is where God made life to thrive. And so this very important concept of just how God made the universe, it becomes in the Bible one of the most important ways of understanding God. And as you read through the Bible, what you'll see time and time again is that everywhere we see light, it becomes a symbol for the presence of God. So when you're reading your Bible and you read verses about light and stories about light, think in your mind, this is something about God's presence here with us. And you can see why it becomes that. I mean, even on the very first page of the Bible, in the first verses, right, we're introduced to a God who steps into the void, right? The earth is unformed, it's empty, and we're told that darkness is hovering over the surface of the deep. And it's into that darkness that God begins to create. And as God acts, as his presence comes into creation to bring life and to make everything that comes into existence, light is the first thing. And light is created before the sun, before the stars, before the things that we think of that produce light. Light just exists because God's presence is there. And as the story goes on, we see God's presence depicted as light many times. I mean, last week we talked about the story of Moses and the burning bush and the way that God's presence was there in the light of this fire that did not consume the bush. This idea of light, it becomes one of the metaphors that the psalmists use to talk about God's presence. This is Psalm 89, verse 15. "Blessed are those who have learned to acclaim you, who walk in the light of your presence, Lord." God's presence with us is light. It becomes one of the ways that the prophets talk about the hope of God's presence coming and fixing things. So in the people's rebellion, when the enemies are taking power, when all hope seems to have been lost, you'll see prophecies like this in Isaiah 9:2. "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. A light has dawned on those living in the land of darkness. See, it may seem dark now. It may seem like darkness has overcome the light, but know that a light will come. God's presence will come again. He will heal. He will fix. This is the way this idea of light works itself out in the Old Testament. And so as Jesus teaches us about his character and who he is, it is no mistake that he uses this metaphor about God's presence to tell us who he is. This is what Jesus is going to say this morning. I am the light of the world. That's Jesus' claim. I am the light of the world. The way that God's presence is depicted as light in creation throughout all the Old Testament story, that's me. I'm here. And the way he teaches us this is brilliant. It's in this moment in the calendar year for the Jewish people that everyone together was remembering this idea of God's presence being light to us. It was during something called the Feast of Tabernacles. So we're going to be in John 8 this morning, but I want to set up the context for where Jesus is going to teach. In John 8, it is the 1 week a year where the Jews celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. We don't talk about that feast very often. You may not be familiar with it. The Feast of Tabernacles was an 8-day period. It started on a Sabbath day and it ended on a Sabbath day. And in the middle, the people would feast and would sing and would praise God, but all of it was pointed back in their history to the point in time when God's people were in the wilderness. And so as you read the Old Testament story, God rescues his people out of Egypt. They were slaves. They were under the most powerful people around, and God saves them and he takes them out. But then for 40 years, they walk through the wilderness. And they don't know where they're going or how to get there. They're completely dependent on God. God gives them manna from heaven to eat for food. He brings water out of the rock for them to drink. He takes care of them. He nurtures them. When they finally get to the promised land, he delivers them into the promised land over nations that were more powerful than they were. It's this moment in their history where their dependence on God was so clear. They could not take care of themselves in any way. It was only God who took care of them. And so the Feast of Tabernacles was a time to remember that. And what they did was for that week, they all left their houses and they lived in tents. They lived in tents, like in the streets, to remember what it was like to be in the wilderness when the people lived in tents and were dependent on God. I mean, can you imagine doing that 1 week a year? You just tell your kids, like, yeah, get out of your rooms, put in a tent in the backyard, and we're going to remember that we are dependent on God. That's what the Feast of Tabernacles is all about. And so they lived in these tents. That's why it's called tabernacles. Tabernacle means tents. But there was more to it than that, because if you remember, or maybe you've never heard this story before, but in the wilderness, when they were wandering around, how did they find where they should go? Like, how did they navigate the wilderness? And it was actually God's presence who showed them. This is Exodus 13:21. The Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to lead them on their way during the day, and in a pillar of fire to give them light at night so they could travel day or night. So picture this. God's people living in tents. They're nomads. They're going through the wilderness. They don't know where they're going. And God's presence comes. In the day, it's a pillar of cloud. But at night, it's a pillar of fire that goes ahead of the people that leads them, showing them where they are to go next. And during the Feast of Tabernacles, to remember this, in the evenings, the people would come to the temple. They'd be bringing offerings. They'd be making sacrifices. They'd be singing praises. But as the sun would go down, the priests would light these special lamps in the temple. And they would burn all night long. And they were the symbol to remember the pillar of fire that led the people through the wilderness, the symbol of God's presence. And it's this Feast of Tabernacles with those lamps lit, reminding the people of God's presence with them, that Jesus sits down and he begins to teach. And maybe you can imagine being there, the excitement, the fullness of Jerusalem as everyone's come to celebrate this, the lamps burning in the background. Jesus sits and begins to talk, and a hush falls over the crowd, and people lean in, and they're listening to Jesus speak. And it's here that we get this in John chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus spoke to them again. I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will never walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world. The light of God's presence that we're remembering here with these lamps. that's me. And the Jews never would have missed what Jesus was saying. Jesus' claim is that he is the presence of God in the world. You want to see God, you want to know what God is like, you want to believe that God is with you, Jesus is saying, that's me, I'm here, I am his presence. And this means so much. This is a massive claim. It would have been blasphemous to many of the people who heard it. And if you read through the rest of John 8, you'll see that most people rejected Jesus' claim here. They can't accept it. And yet, remember why you're hearing this morning. The invitation is so that you would believe Jesus that this is true, that God's presence is here with you today through Jesus' Spirit, because Jesus is the presence of God in the world. And if you can accept that teaching this morning, it means so much. I want to point out just 3 things that this means as Jesus explains who he is. If Jesus is the light of the world, the first thing it means is that Jesus is the light that guides. Just like that pillar of fire at night in the wilderness that showed them how to get through. Jesus is saying, that's who I am for you. I'm the one who will show you how to get through the wilderness to the promised land. And we need that. This idea of the wilderness from the Old Testament story, it is not just this kind of fun history fact about God's people to just know in your head, yep, there was that time in the wilderness. No, the wilderness season from the Old Testament, it becomes one of the ways the Bible teaches us about our life, about what it means to be human, that to live is to be in the wilderness. See, we all have deep longings and needs that we are incapable of fulfilling on our own. Just like the people of God were in the wilderness with not enough to eat, with not enough to drink, and it was God who had to meet their needs. That is the human experience. We have needs, we cannot meet them. And also, the wilderness speaks to the confusion of life. That in the wilderness, it is not clear where you should go next, how you should get to the promised land, how you should find water. There's multiple options. No one knows the right answer. Everybody's trying to figure it out for themselves. And it becomes this metaphor for human life, which is that we all want to get to the promised land. We all want to build a rich and meaningful, satisfying life. Every human being wants that, whether you're a Christian or not, whatever religion you ascribe to, whether you believe there's a God or you don't. Everyone wants to build a full, rich life. But how do you do it? See, that's why life is like a wilderness. There's a lot of paths out there. There's a lot of people who will try to show you how to build the right life for yourself. How do you know which way to go? Let me show you what I mean. Pew Research surveys American parents, and this is from just a couple years ago, and asking parents, what do you want most for your kids? Now, presumably, these parents love their kids and want them to have rich, full, meaningful lives. And so Pew Research is saying, okay, as you think of your kids and their life and what they're going to do, like, what do you want most for them to be able to get the most out of life? And this is how Americans respond right now. 88% of parents say that it is extremely or very important for my kids to be financially independent. Might be a little self-interest in that one, like, get out of my house. 88% think it's extremely or very important that they have jobs or careers they enjoy. Okay, significantly less, but still a significant number. 41% say it's extremely or very important that my kids have a college degree. See, there's a clear pattern here. Right now, the American wisdom on parents is that if you want your kids to thrive, it's the realm of money and work and education. That's going to be the thing that gives the most meaning in life. Now, significantly less, but some parents say it's extremely or very important that my kids get married. Some 20% say it's extremely or very important that my kids have children. But you can see, there's a disagreement here about what's going to actually bring the most value out of life. And we live in one moment right now where we really value money and career and education. But this survey, if it was taken 50 years ago, would have been very different. 50 years ago, parents would have said, marriage is actually what is going to help my kids thrive. Like, they need to get married, and they need to have kids, and a lot of kids, and we don't really believe that anymore. But, what's the right answer? I mean, some of you grew up in a time when the church had adopted that kind of 50 years ago mentality that marriage was the end of life. We kind of Christianized that American vision that, you aren't even really a full human being until you've gotten married and had a couple kids, and that's how God's going to bless you, and that's God's plan for your life, and he will honor that. And by the way, marriage is an incredible gift of God. I'm all for it, but we went a little too far. I wonder, though, if we've come the other way now a little bit too much as well, though, that even as Christians, as followers of Jesus, we've believed the American idea that really success in life and meaning in life comes down to having enough money, having the right job, getting the education you need to get those two things. Is that right? How do you know how to get through the wilderness? How do you know how to build that rich, satisfying life? We're in another moment right now as a society. We're having a big conversation about what it means to get the most out of life. And there's a new narrative being pushed, which is that you cannot have a rich, satisfying life unless you are completely free to express yourself sexually. Unless you're completely free to be in a romantic relationship, to be in a sexual relationship with whoever you want, whether they are the opposite gender or the same gender as you, or they don't know what gender they are. Unless you are able to express your gender identity exactly how you want to, whatever feels the most true to you, that ability to do that is key to what it means to build a full and satisfying life. That is a narrative that is out there in our culture right now. So how do we know? I mean, this is the moment that Jesus speaks into when he says, I am the light of the world. He's saying life is confusing. It is hard to know how to build the life that you want for yourself. He says, let me guide you. I'm the light of God's presence. I'm the one who will show you where the promised land is. Can you believe that because I created you, I know how you're wired, I also know what's good for you? When I invite you to follow me, it's not just to do the right thing, it is to do the best thing. It is to do the thing that will free you from the bondage of sin and darkness in this world, that you will actually thrive as you follow me as the light of the world. That's the claim that Jesus is making. But it's a hard claim to believe. And the reason is because if you start following Jesus, pretty quickly you will realize that you do not like where he's leading you some of the time, maybe a lot of the time. Because Jesus has this habit of leading us to the cross, of leading us to the place of laying down our life and picking up our cross to follow him, of radically being generous with what we have to give towards others, of forgiving and even loving our enemies, of laying down our wants, our needs, all of that, and saying, I'm going to live for Jesus and I'm going to live for others. And that doesn't feel like that's going to give you that rich, satisfying life. It feels like it's going to be deprivation. And yet, this is the claim. This is the ask. Will you believe Jesus that what he invites you to is actually the way out of the wilderness into the promised land? This claim that Jesus is the light of the world, it's not just that he's the light that guides you to what's best. Light also does something else. And this is the second aspect that I'm going to unpack about Jesus being the light of the world. So Jesus is the light that exposes. See, that's what light does. It shows reality for what it really is. It lets you see the truth. And that can sound good, and it is good, but it also can be a little unsettling. It can be a little unpleasant. See, sometimes when light shows reality for what it is, we don't really want to see it. I'm raising young kids right now, and we're at the stage where everything they play with is the size that it can be lost under our couch. I don't know if any of you are in that same season of life. It seems like 10 times a day I'm with my kids, and they're telling me something is lost under the couch. Will you get it for me? And so this is where I spend like all my time at home, on the ground, and I'm looking under the couch. And the thing about darkness, which is, it's pretty dark under here, you know, this is my life, you guys. This is all the time, okay? So I've got a golf club, and I'm like, I can tell that there's a lot of stuff under here. But in the darkness, it doesn't look that bad. Like, you know, it looks like they've lost every toy they've ever had under here, but it doesn't look that bad. But I can't find the one car I'm looking for, and so I get a flashlight, and I shine my light under the couch. And as soon as the light is shown, it is horrifying under here. I mean, like 100 Cheerios, you know, all the toys, but like things like, I don't even know how they got under here. It's like, whose underwear is this? And how did you lose it under the couch? I mean, really, like, half-eaten applesauce pouch is growing mold, and like empty chocolate milk container, and like this, you know, lollipop that's stuck to the ground, and like, you know, it's awful. And so, but finally I get the car, and I'm like, okay, well, I probably should clean this up, but I'm not going to. I mean, one day we'll move, you know, and the light exposes reality. You can walk around in your house believing the lie that it's pretty clean, and as soon as the light shows up, you have to deal with the reality. And the thing is, it's not just true under our couches, it's true in our hearts. That we can believe everything's fine. We can believe this myth, this narrative that we're good, we do the right thing, we love other people really well. But Jesus shows up as the light of the world. He shows the reality of what it really is. And the thing is, we don't always like to see it. See, John says this in John chapter 3, and maybe if you've been around church, you've heard one of the most well-known verses, John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever would believe would receive eternal life," right? That's John 3:16. But what about John 3:19, when he tells us what happens when the Son comes into the world? This is John 3:19. This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than the light because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it so that his deeds may not be exposed. But anyone who lives by the truth comes to the light so that his works may be shown to be accomplished by God. It's a great thing that Jesus is the light of the world, but what John is saying here is you also got to know it's going to have a cost. You're going to have to be willing to be exposed. And if you've been in the darkness, the truth is that we can get comfortable in the darkness. We can get so accustomed to it that we don't actually want to let the light in because we don't want everybody to see what's really going on in here. Do you know that that's true, that you can get comfortable in darkness? I mean, let me show you what I mean. Let's kill the lights in here. See, when we first get in darkness, it's a little unsettling, is it not? I mean, maybe your heart rate just spiked a little bit, a little nervous. There's people around you don't know. Now we're in the dark, and I'm not going to leave you in here too long. Don't worry. But the longer we're in here, you kind of get used to it, don't you? I mean, you notice that it's not quite as dark as you thought. Your eyes are dilating a little bit. And if you're in darkness long enough, it actually can be very comforting. I mean, it can even, be something that you desire. Have you heard people are doing darkness retreats now? Like Aaron Rodgers, Green Bay quarterback, he went to a darkness retreat and came out of jet. It can feel good to be in the darkness. The thing is, the longer we're in here, the harder it is to come into the lights. The more painful, the more disrupting it is, because to come into the light, it can feel a little bit like this. See, Jesus is the light of the world, but we're not on our own able to come into that light. Like that light, it can be blinding, it can be uncomfortable. The darkness doesn't love it. And so to recognize Jesus as the light of the world, it is to make a decision. Will you allow that to happen? Will you allow yourself to be honest with your sinfulness, with your brokenness, with your need, and will you be willing to go through the discomfort of letting Jesus expose it? That's what he wants to do. He's the light of the world. But here's the good news. As uncomfortable as that can be, it's worth it. Because not only does light expose, but light also expels. And this is the last thing we're going to talk about. Jesus is the light of the world that expels the powers of darkness, and that gives us hope in the midst of a dark world. So one of the beautiful things about light is that it is so much more powerful than darkness. It's not even comparable. In a pitch black room, one tiny candle can illuminate it. In the dense, deep, dark forest on an overcast night when the darkness is palpable, one small flashlight can show you the way through. I mean, think about our solar system. One star can illuminate every planet in our expansive solar system. When you walk out on a night and you look at the stars, every star you see is millions of light years away, and the light is cutting through just vast darkness of space. Light always overpowers darkness. And when Jesus says that he is the light of the world, he is making that claim of himself as well. That in this dark world, he is the light that will shine, that will overcome it, and the powers of darkness will never be able to overcome him. This is how John introduces us to Jesus in chapter 1. He says that Jesus is the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. And then pay attention to this, verse 4. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. See, sometimes we forget this as followers of Jesus. We live like we think the powers of darkness have the power to overcome light, and they do not. We spend all of our time fearful, anxious about what might happen, about how the world is, the state of politics, the state of morality in our country, the state of armed conflicts around the world. Maybe it's brokenness in your marriage. Maybe it's brokenness with your kids. And we fret because we're not sure that Jesus really is the light of the world who has the power to overcome all darkness, and yet he does. See, there is nothing in this world that is too powerful for Jesus to deal with. That means you're never too far gone. It means your marriage is never too far gone. It means your kids are never too far gone. You will never get yourself into a situation that Jesus can't get you out of. You will never sin so much that Jesus cannot forgive you. You will never have such a low view of yourself that Jesus can't lift you up. So the power of darkness is very real. Never forget it. We see it all around us. We see the way that division and strife, that enmity, that deceit, that selfishness, that pride, we see the damage it brings into our creation. It's real. But what Jesus says is, I am the light of the world. And like we sang this morning, I'm making all things new. Jesus is never going to abandon this creation. He's never going to abandon you. And no matter where you find yourself, will you believe that Jesus is the light of the world and he can do more than you can imagine in situations that seem hopeless to you? And so that's the invitation to us this morning. Will we believe? And I'm going to invite the band to come out, and we're going to keep singing this morning. But before we do that, I want to give you just some time on your own, in your own heart, to pray and to invite Jesus to do what he is claiming to be able to do in your life right now. To invite him to be the one that guides you through the wilderness, that shows you how he made you and what he made you for. And maybe this morning you need to recognize, you need to be honest, that you've been pursuing some other things. That you've been seeking fullness, that you've been seeking meaning and satisfaction in some of the things that he's created in this world, but not in him. And maybe that's something that you need to talk to Jesus about this morning. Maybe you need to pray this morning and invite Jesus to expose some sin in your heart. Maybe you've been holding on to darkness, you've been hiding from the light, you haven't wanted to acknowledge what's really going on, and maybe this morning is the morning to come clean and say, Jesus, show me for what I really am. Show me the truth about the way that I've been rebelling against you, and help me to believe that you offer forgiveness because the cross is taking care of everything. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to earn anything. What you nailed to the cross is done with, and so I can believe that I am family now because of you. Expose my sin for what it really is. Maybe you need to invite Jesus to expel the darkness in your life. Maybe it's what you've been doing, maybe it's your actions, but maybe it's the actions of others. Maybe it's the darkness of this world that has filled you with anxiety, that has filled you with fear. Let Jesus be the light of the world that gives you confidence that you can trust him no matter what's going on. So whatever you need this morning, we're gonna take a minute and just in silence in your heart, let's spend some time with Jesus and invite him in this morning. Go ahead. The light has come into the world, and the darkness has not overcome it. Jesus, we are so thankful for that truth this morning. That there's nothing out of your reach, there's nothing you can't do. And so we just come to the foot of the cross this morning with our own mess, with our own darkness, with our own lives that have gone astray, and ask you to come in, ask for your forgiveness, ask for your hope, ask that you would guide us. Lord, as you continue to shape us into people of light? Would you make this a community that shines as a light to the world around us? That when people see us and our relationships, even though we're flawed, they see the light of Jesus here and are invited to come in. Lord, use our lives, use our families, use us in any way you desire for your kingdom, for your glory. We love you. Amen.